All right, so we're going to talk about vegetable gardening. You know, with this latest warm weather we had last week, a lot of people were getting really excited and wanting to go ahead and plant. But obviously, it was too early because this week we're having snow and temperatures down to 7 degrees later in the week. So still a little early for planting, but it's a good time to be thinking about it and getting ready for it. So we'll be talking about that today. This is billed as kind of a beginning vegetable gardening class, but really I would say it's more of an intermediate. It'll be helpful for people who are beginners, but for people who've already done vegetable gardening, this will bring a lot of clarity and information that will be helpful to you. So I talk about the 4 phases of vegetable gardening. The first one is preparing. The second one will be the actual planting of the garden. And then the third phase is caring for the garden, all the different maintenance tasks that you do to take care of the plants. And then the fourth one, of course, is harvesting and storing the produce. And as with many things in life, the biggest part is the preparing, doing the preparation. So we'll be spending quite a bit of time on that. And some of you may already have some of this figured out, but I think it will be helpful to people to know about preparing. So picking the garden for the site, picking the site for the garden, picking the site for the garden is very critical. There are sites that are not too good in your yard, and there's places that are really good in your yard, hopefully. But the perfect site does not exist. So I just tell people to try and pick the best site available. And that's going to be a site that has the best combination of these 3 components that I have listed there, which is full sun and good soil and sufficient drainage. Those are the really, really important things when you're picking your garden site. Full sun, versus shade is a major deal for vegetable gardens. I have more people struggle because their yards have too much tree shade and they're just not getting enough sun for their vegetables. And so they'll ask me things like, which vegetables grow the best in shade? And the answer is none. All of your vegetables grow their best in full sun. There's a few that maybe benefit from a little shade in the afternoon if it's starting to be hot summer, like lettuce. If you're trying to go lettuce in the late spring, starting to get hot, yeah, maybe a little shade in the afternoon. But for the most part, you want full sun. And so that think of like a minimum of 8 hours of strong sun, meaning in the strong part of the day, sort of that 9 to 5 type timing period. It's especially important for vegetables that produce fruit. And if you don't know what I mean by that, I mean things that flower and then have little fruits on them. So think of things like tomatoes and peppers and eggplant and squash and melons, cucumbers. Those are all fruiting vegetables. And that process of flowering and fruiting takes more sunshine than just growing leaves. If you do have more shade, you should be able to grow things like lettuce and the different greens like Swiss chard and kale. They're a little more tolerant of some shade. But the fruiting vegetables need more sunshine. And also plants that are growing in full sun, they're going to be sturdier. When plants are stretching out to get light, the stems aren't as strong, and sometimes they fall over during windy weather, etc. So how do you get more sun? Well, one way is you can trim branches or remove trees if necessary. That's kind of a big deal, so I try and avoid that if possible. So also plant away from the building. You don't want to be too close to the house. The south side of the house is okay because the sun is the best on the south side. But if you're looking around your yard and maybe you've got a few trees here and a few trees there in a building, I tell people kind of check the site at different times of day, like at 9 o'clock and 11 and 1 and 3 and 5, and see if it's in the sun's full sun all of those times. And that will let you know if that's a good spot. But part of the tricky part about doing that right now is there's no leaves on the trees. And so it's really hard to tell sometimes if a spot is going to be in sun. You have to look for the shadow of the branches and decide if it's going to be in the shade or if it's going to get full sun. Full sun is good, but everyone also wants good soil. So the big question is there good soil? And it's hard to know sometimes. So I tell people also you're looking for the best soil on the site. And you'd think the soil would be the same throughout your backyard, but It's not. Lots of times the best soil will be located farther away from the house. And that is because when they build houses, you know, they tear up the ground and they move the dirt around and the topsoil gets moved. And sometimes it doesn't always get put back in the right place or the right depth. And so, especially newer houses, lots of times they skim off some of the topsoil and they'll sell it or they'll move it to some other location. So older houses typically will have better topsoil, but still, usually you want to stay farther away from the house. So I tell people to go out and look for good soil, take a shovel, turn over a shovelful, you know, about 6 or 8 inches deep and see what it looks like. So you're trying to avoid areas that have lots of clay. And of course, the good soil will have loose texture. It'll crumble when you try to crush it. It won't stick in a ball, stick together, and it'll be darker color as opposed to clay, which tends to be more brown. So you're looking for dark soil. That's usually an indicator of high organic matter. So again, usually further away from the house is better, but you might have to go out and try several places to find the best soil on your backyard. And then drainage. You need adequate drainage, and all this refers to is the ability of the soil to carry away excess water. If you go out in your backyard after a really heavy rain and you see kind of a puddle of water standing there, that is a sign that the drainage is not good. And usually that should drain away in less than 24 hours if you see a puddle. If it stands for longer than 24 hours, that's a sign that the drainage is really bad. But in general, you're looking for areas that are level as possible. And actually, you want to avoid hillsides too. Hillsides have great drainage. The problem is typically the water runs off too fast and the plants don't get a chance to soak it up. So unless you're building terraces or unless you are using some raised beds, steep hillsides are to be avoided. And of course, avoid the low places where the water pools after the rain. And again, avoid clay soils. Clay soils, because the little soil particles are so small, they stick together and they don't let the water move through and drain out. Whereas like a sandy soil, the water will drain out easier. So one way to improve bad drainage is to add organic matter. And yet another way to improve bad drainage would be to build raised beds, because that raises the soil up and allows the water to drain out. We'll talk a little bit more about raised beds here in just a little bit. So we're still trying to pick the best site. Hopefully you've been able to find that. And then you're going to make a garden plan. In fact, every single gardening book that you ever read will tell you about the importance of making a garden plan. And a garden plan is more than just a diagram. It's kind of thinking about what's going to be the guiding philosophy behind your garden. Are you going to think about having raised beds, or are you going to have just ground plots? Are you going to grow your things organically or non-organically? And also, what crops are you going to pick? There's a million different vegetables to pick from. And which ones do you want to grow in your garden? And then also the actual layout of the garden. Where are you going to locate things, and how much space are you going to give each crop? Those are more of the things that will come into making a garden diagram. And then variety selection. Let's say you want to grow tomatoes, but you got to figure out what kind of tomato, because there's many different kinds of tomatoes. So those are all part of what's going to be your garden plan. And so as you're getting ready to plant your garden, you want to have these things figured out. As far as raised beds versus ground plots, if you've been around gardening at all for just a little bit or done any reading, you've probably heard about raised beds. And what they mean is that's just a raised garden bed where the soil is raised up from the ground level. Usually it's at least 6 inches, sometimes 8 inches, sometimes even 10 or 12 inches. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to build sort of a wooden frame, a box, and then fill it with good soil. But there's other ways. We'll talk about that too. So the advantage of raised beds are many. The soil will warm up quicker in the spring, which is good, because lots of times the seeds don't start sprouting until the soil warms up. But also it will give you better soil drainage because it's raised up. The water will drain down and go out the sides or out the bottom. You can actually grow more food per square foot in raised beds, so it's good for production. And then the disadvantages are that the materials can be expensive to buy lumber. I don't know if you priced lumber lately, but it has gone up tremendously, even in the last 2 months. But over the last year, the price of lumber has increased dramatically. And the soil that you need for the beds, that can be expensive too, because typically that would be something like you would order, you know, a truckload of soil, or go get a truckload of soil, and that can be expensive also. So those would be the disadvantages. There are different types of raised beds, as I mentioned. It's typically, you know, people will build them out of a wooden frame using some boards. You could also use bricks or landscape blocks. Some people use concrete blocks. You can actually pour concrete, although that's really tricky and difficult to do. But you can also make raised beds that are just mounded dirt. If you look in this picture here, you'll see that the beds are raised up about 8 inches, and they're just mounded, and they're kind of sloped gradually on the sides like that. And so that, you know, removes the expense of buying lumber or you know, landscaping blocks. And so the way to do that would be to till up your garden, you know, shovel dirt into a long mound, and then shape the bed kind of with your hand or with a shovel and a rake. And then you also want to slope the top and sides to catch water. That's one of the most important things. You don't want it to be shaped convex. You want it to be concave so that it will actually act like a little basin on top and catch the water. The other thing is you will have to maintain the sides. And one of the best ways to do that is to put mulch on the side of the bed so that the rain won't wash away the soil on the side. So those are some different ways to build raised beds. Up above where it says wooden boards, I have a void treated wood, and that's actually from when I made this slide presentation the first time many years ago, or a number of years ago. And treated lumber was a lot more dangerous because it had some strong chemicals, some arsenic in it, which is not a good chemical to be having in your garden. So they don't make that kind of treated lumber anymore. It's made with just copper compounds, and it's relatively safe to use. So I am now changing my philosophy on the treated lumber, and I feel it's okay to use the treated lumber in the vegetable garden. You just would not want to use any of the old treated lumber, or you would not want to use like railroad ties, which are treated with a toxic chemical also. So the in-ground plots, you know, that's how people used to make gardens most of the time. Basically, where you just till up the ground and you just lay out your garden. The advantages is that you can have lots of space. To make a big garden with raised beds would cost a fortune. So if you have a big space and you want to have a big garden, ground plots are definitely the way to go. They're probably less labor intensive because you don't have to build the beds, which takes quite a bit of time and effort. You don't have that expensive construction cost, and you can till in between the rows. So that's also an advantage and a disadvantage. So look at this picture here. You see like a row of plants, and then there's a path, a row of plants, and then a path. And so that's how you keep the weeds down, is you either take a rototiller or a hoe and you go down on the path in between and break up the ground periodically, cultivate it lightly to stop the weeds from growing. You could also put mulch down, which would be my preference, because that will help your garden in other ways. But it doesn't use space very efficiently because you have this big path in between each row of plants, and that means there's a lot of path space. In a raised bed, you don't have near as much path space, and you can have the plants closer together. The other advantage with raised beds that I didn't mention is you can go out in your raised bed and, you know, plant stuff. You can harvest, you can pull weeds relatively soon after a rain. In the ground plot, after the rain, sometimes it's a while before you can get in there. In fact, here's the disadvantage of the ground plots. So the soil does not warm up as quickly as the raised bed. It's less well drained. It will stay wet longer, which means that it's hard. You should not be walking on it when it's wet because you don't want to pack it down. And even when you're walking on it when it's dry, you're going to be walking on those paths in between the plants, and you're going to be packing that down every time you go up and down that road. You know, it's harder for plants, and in the raised beds, the plants are not getting compacted soil, so the roots are able to penetrate and grow through the soil very easily. And then, of course, the conventional ground plots, they take up a lot more space because you have that path space in between each row. And then still a third option besides the raised beds and the ground plots would be containers. And a lot of people are doing containers, especially if you don't really have a great space for the ground plot or even raised beds. Let's say you have a small patio, or sometimes people are even on a balcony. They'll do some garden containers. I usually think of containers as a last resort. If I could, I would put in a raised bed before I would put in a bunch of containers, just because it's a lot less work. It's probably less expensive. Disadvantages to the containers would be the cost, materials, buying large containers, because you don't want to use just small containers. You need fairly good sized containers. Like these barrels here are 55-gallon plastic drums that have been cut in half. But you can buy, large garden pots that can be fairly expensive. Containers also dry out more quickly than ground plots. And so if you don't water them often enough, your plants can dry out real quickly, and sometimes you'll be surprised and you might actually lose a crop because you didn't water it in time. They also produce limited amounts of food. This little container is 2 feet across, which is a pretty good sized container, but still, if you wanted to have, 6 tomato plants, you would need 6 containers probably, because you cannot probably only put 1 tomato plant in a container that size. It's limited space will produce a limited amount of food. But if that's all you've got, or I once knew a lady who that's the only sunshine she had was on her driveway, so she put her containers on her driveway. The advantage, though, for containers would be that, like the raised bed, it's a good way to overcome poor soil conditions. Let's say your backyard is just horrible soil, either very rocky or lots of clay. You can use containers and fill them with really good soil and get good plant growth that way. They're also, to a limited degree, portable. You can move them around. Once they're full of soil, especially depending on what kind of soil, it could be very heavy. Once they're wet, if you water them, they're very heavy. So they're not easy to move, but you can put them on a little dolly cart and move them around if you need to. And then also there's a taller height, which makes it easy if you have some mobility issues. If it's hard for you to bend over, or if you were in a wheelchair, the tall container gardens are really, really helpful for situations like that too. All right, we're still making our plans for our garden, and one of the decisions I mentioned earlier was whether or not to do an organic garden or a non-organic garden. And really what that comes down to is using synthetic chemicals for controlling insects or controlling weeds or controlling diseases. And there's, all kinds of information out there, and, some people will say, oh, these chemicals are safe. There's a lot of chemicals that are advertised as safe for vegetables that I am just not comfortable using. I think there's lots of information that's not known about eating them, ingesting those chemicals over long periods of time. Even if you try to wash it off, does it really wash off? These are all questions that aren't totally answered to my satisfaction. So I do recommend organic gardening, which doesn't mean necessarily that you won't use any chemicals, but would mean that you'll use organic, natural-based chemicals if you are going to use them. Those would be chemicals that break down quickly, do not persist in the environment, are not going to be toxic for pets and for children and things like that. So there really is a case to be made for organic gardening. So some people, their solution is just go to the hardware store, ask them what to spray for this kind of bug, and then go home and spray. And Again, that's not the best way to go about it. You might think about, are there other ways to control insects? There are many cultural controls you can do, like rotating your crops. Sometimes you can plant resistant varieties so that your plants will be able to resist the insect attack. Sometimes even just tilling the ground at a certain time of the year in the fall will help cut down on the insect population, because you're destroying the insect eggs which have been buried in the soil. There are also insect predators. In our greenhouse, we actually import some insects that are predators that go around and eat aphids. There's insect exclusion, which means you're screening them out. There are actually some special screens or row cover materials that you can put over plants to screen out insects. And then even some insects, there's not that many of them. Like I think of the tomato hornworm, there's just a few, maybe 2 or 3 on one plant, and you can just pick them off and get rid of them by hand. Potato bugs, sometimes people will pick those off by hand. And then there's also some traps that you can utilize. Like a lot of people are dealing with problems from Japanese beetles. And if you have Japanese beetles, you can put out traps that will attract them and catch them so you can get rid of them. So there's lots of different ways besides even the organic sprays for controlling insects. And you can use a combination of these and figure out what is the best way for you in your garden to control insects. The other part of organic gardening is adding organic material to your soil, which is something that helps build your soil. And so, you might use a chemical fertilizer, but that's not really adding organic material to your soil to help build it. The more organic matter you add to your soil, the better off it will be. And so I recommend every year, or at least every 2 years, you're adding some additional organic matter to your soil to help improve it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. All right, now we're talking about which crops are you going to grow, because you're getting ready to make your plan on paper. I tell people, it sounds kind of silly or simple, grow what you like to eat. But what that means is, I like to eat lots of different vegetables, but there's probably 4 or 5 vegetables that are my main vegetables and the ones that I really would like to grow the most because I want to have lots of them. And one of them would be red peppers. Like I'm looking at this picture right here and it's making my mouth water because I love red peppers. And if you haven't ever priced red bell peppers in the store, they are very expensive. They're usually at least $1, $1.50, $2. I've seen them $2.50 even. And so at that price, you might think, I can't afford to buy very many peppers. But if you're going to grow your own, you can grow lots of red peppers and probably have all you want. So I like lots of red peppers. I love onions. I like sweet potatoes. And of course, I like tomatoes. Those are some of my main crops that I really, really like to grow. It would be hard to imagine a garden without those for me. But you might like other things better. Maybe squash, zucchini squash is your favorite, or lettuce, or green beans. So think about which crops you probably would use the most, and that it's maybe hardest to get the fresh ones that you want. Like it is really hard to get a good, fresh, ripe tomato. Even in the summer, if you go to a store, it's hard to find good tomatoes. Probably your best bet would be to go to a farmer's market. So that's why it's really worthwhile growing your own tomatoes. I also tell people to start small. Don't plow up the whole backyard. Don't put in 25 raised beds because you might not be able to take care of all that space. But start small. You can always make your garden bigger next year and make it a little bit larger each year until you get to the ideal size for your garden. I also just recommend don't try growing 20 different kinds of vegetables the first year because some are just easier than others. I think of things like carrots. They're a little hard sometimes because the seeds are small and you have to thin them out. Sweet corn can be tricky because you have to get good pollination, so you have to plant at least 3 rows of it and fertilize it and thin it and different things like that. Brussels sprouts are difficult sometimes because there's so many insect problems all along the summer. Same thing with squash. So, you know, start with some easy stuff and maybe pick 3, 4. I say 2 to 3, probably 3 is a good number, 3, 4, 5 crops. And so one of those I would pick would probably always be peppers because they're pretty easy to grow. But right up close to there would be tomatoes, which are pretty easy to grow, although you do have to figure out a way to make them stand up. So you either have to use tomato stakes or tomato cages or some kind of a trellis system. Lettuce is usually a pretty good bet also. Sweet potatoes, those are all pretty easy. So those are some of the easier ones. So when you're making your plan, your garden diagram, figure out how far apart things are going to be. Some of this information you can find on the internet, but you could also find that on our seed packets. When we sell seeds, it'll have that information on there. We also have on our website, we have an online planning tool that you can use that will help you figure out the spacing and how much space you're going to need for your garden. I think you can actually do it for a raised bed, or you can actually do it for a ground plots. And that's just something really helpful, like how far apart are you going to put your sweet potatoes? How far apart should the rows be? When you plant your zucchini squash, how much do you thin out the seeds so how far the plants will be? And how big will that zucchini plant get when it totally gets large and spreads out and takes over your whole backyard? So you want to know all those kinds of things. So making a diagram is really good. And you know what? The first year diagram isn't going to be perfect. The next year, you'll know a little bit more like, oh my gosh, I should have given my zucchini 4 feet wide and I only gave them 2 feet wide. So you'll learn things like that, you know, in your first year of gardening. But I do recommend that website tool for you if you're trying to help plan out your diagram for planting your garden. And then save your garden from year to year because you'll want to know where you planted things. And we'll talk about why that's important in a little bit also. All right, we're still planning. So let's say you figured out, you know, you're going to have this much space for your tomatoes, this much for your lettuce, this much for your green beans, this much for your onions and your peppers. Now the question is, what varieties are you going to grow? And, you know, if you've been a gardener for a while, or if you're fairly new, you may have gotten some seed catalogs, which is one of the most fun things to look at in January and February and even March, to look at all the different varieties. There's so many different varieties of all the different vegetables. And a lot of them are good for different purposes. Some of them are really good. Some of them are just average. You know, I like to try different varieties and see which ones I like the best. And the varieties that we offer here at Kansas City Community Gardens are ones that we like the best, that we've had good luck with. And we think you would have good luck because of the part of the country we're in, but also just because of the characteristics of these individual varieties that might be better. Like, for instance, that onion superstar there that I mentioned, it's a white onion. It's really good because it grows a big bulb. That's one of the biggest challenges for people trying to grow bulb onions is to get a good sized bulb. And Superstar is really good at doing that. You still have to do the other important things, water and fertilize, give enough space, plant at the right time. But you'll have much better luck with Superstar because it's well suited to our part of the country. Lettuce, canasta lettuce, that's the picture there. It's one of my favorite lettuces because it makes a nice crisp head, but it's really a rich green and red lettuce. It's not like an iceberg lettuce, but it makes a nice loose crisp head. It's actually called the crisp head lettuce. And it also doesn't go to seed too quickly, which happens with lots of other lettuce varieties. Tomatoes, we have lots of great tomatoes, Goliath, Whopper, Celebrity. We're kind of excited about a new one that we are trying this year called Iron Lady. If you look at our website or look at our seed catalog called the Seeders Digest, you will hear about that one. The reason we're excited about it is because it's disease resistant, and tomatoes get so many diseases. And the varieties that we pick, like Goliath and Whopper and Celebrity, are resistant to several tomato diseases. But this Iron Lady is resistant to a whole bunch of diseases. It's probably the most disease-resistant tomato ever developed. And it's relatively new. It's been around for just a few years, but we've just been hearing about it recently. And I think if you've had difficulty growing tomatoes, it could be something that would help you out. Peppers, that picture of the red pepper we saw a minute ago, that was Gypsy, which is one of my favorite. It's a Hungarian type pepper, very sweet as it turns red. It starts out yellow, starts out green and then goes yellow and then turns orange and then red. So it's a very colorful pepper and it produces lots and lots of peppers. If you want a big bell pepper, that Red Knight is really a good one. Of course, it starts out green and then ripens to red, but it makes a really large bell pepper also. And sweet potatoes, we have a variety we call Beauregard. It will be time to place orders for sweet potatoes pretty soon. There'll be information about that on our website. But we like the Beauregard. It lasts for a long time after you harvest it. The potatoes will actually last for like 9 months, 10 months, even a year, which is great. And they're very productive and nutritious. So these are just some of the varieties. If you look at our website or look at the Seeders Digest, which we have at our office, you can see all the different great varieties that we have at Kansas City Community Gardens. And the same thing in seeds. Those were plants that we just looked at. In seeds, we have all these different varieties, which you can look at those and see all the different varieties we have also. We also have some specialty seeds that we call our beanstalk seeds, which is a special line of specialty seeds. I'm saying special a lot, but that's because they are really special. So things like the Swiss chard bright lights, there's also some great varieties that are really well suited to children's garden and especially fun for children's gardens. So check out the list of beanstalk seeds on our website also. All right, we're still preparing. And one thing that comes up lots of times is soil testing. People often ask me, do I need to get my soil tested before I have a garden? And I would say, no, you don't need to. If your garden seems to have fairly good topsoil, the texture seems loose and crumbly, it's relatively dark, when it's moist, and it's not sticky like clay, then probably you could get by without doing a soil test right away. Because I know sometimes people will wait and wait because they have to figure out, where do I get a soil test? How do I do it? And so that gets in the way of actual planting when you should be planting. You can always do a soil test sometime this summer or fall, and then make adjustments for next year. And ironically enough, when you get your soil test results, it comes back, it just doesn't say like good or bad. It will tell you certain things like potassium and phosphorus. That's what that P and K are. Those are the initials, for those elements. Those are important nutrients. It'll tell you about that. It'll tell you about the pH level, which is something also you learned about in science class in 8th grade or whatever. Is the soil acidic or is it basic? Most of the soils around here are a little on the basic side. They'll also tell you the percent of organic matter, and that's probably one of the most useful things. If your soil has organic matter level of 5% or higher, that is really good. If it's lower than that, you will definitely want to be thinking about adding some organic matter soon. The soil will not tell you about the soil test will not tell you about the nitrogen level because that changes so much because nitrogen leaches out of the soil and moves through the soil. And it also, the soil test is not going to test for toxic material. Sometimes people are worried about, is there some kind of toxic material in your soil? And I would say generally not in your backyard. That's not something you expect unless your backyard used to be a farm field where they did lots of toxic chemicals, or an old orchard, the old apple orchards, they used to spray a lot of toxic chemicals. Or if maybe there was a building torn down on your site, you might have some lead in the soil. There are some places you can send away your soil to get tested for lead if you're concerned about that. But other than that, it's just kind of good to know what was the history of the soil. Was it a farm field, where they used to use a lot of herbicides, over the last few years, or has it just been, a pasture which didn't get any chemical use at all? So that is soil testing. But usually the best place to get soil testing would be with your local extension service. If you're on the Missouri side, there's the Missouri Extension Service. If you're on the Kansas side, there's the Kansas Extension Service, and they can go to their websites. They can help you figure out about getting your soil tested. All right, so that is all the planning. Now we're going to be talking about preparing the soil. And preparing for the garden, and what do you do that? And soil preparation, how do you get it ready, and all those kinds of questions. And one of the questions I get about your soil is, you'll read about adding soil amendments. And a soil amendment just means whatever you're adding to the soil. It could be limestone, could be fertilizer, could be manure, could be some other kind of organic matter. And the important thing to remember probably is organic matter. It really is. If you want to make your soil better, it's all about adding organic matter. And there's different materials you can use to do that. But the reason you want more organic matter is because it does wonderful things for your plants and the life of organisms in your soil. So it will increase the water holding capacity, because organic matter will act like a sponge and help your garden hold more water, which is important in the heat of summer when you're watering your garden a lot. If you have good organic matter level, you won't have to water your garden quite as often, and your plants will be able to have more water available. The other thing organic matter does is it increases the pore space, which refers to the little air spaces in between the soil particles. And this is important because that means you'll have better drainage. If the pore spaces are small, like in clay, the drainage is not good because the water sticks in there. If the pore space is larger, the water will drain through, and so the water won't stay in there too long. It also increases the nutrient holding capacity. When you fertilize the sandy soil, a lot of the nutrients just kind of wash on through. But if you put fertilizer down on organic soil, it will stick to the organic particles and stay and be more available to the plants. So it's kind of a simplified version of that explanation or whatever. It also will increase the soil microbial activity. So think of all the different little soil organisms, bacteria, fungi, all kinds of little organisms that live in the soil, that do all the chemical reactions that make plant growth possible and release the nutrients to make it available to plants. That all happens in the presence of organic matter. And even the larger organisms, think like earthworms and other insects that help in the soil. If there's lots of organic matter, they will thrive. If there's not, they will suffer. So, and then just on a practical point, it's easier to till up a garden. It's easier to plant, easier to hoe, easier to rake if you have lots of organic matter, because it's going to be loose and crumbly. And if you're going to rototill it, it's easier to do that. If you're digging it up with a spade, it's all so much easier to do it if you have lots of organic matter. It will make your soil so much better. So the best time for adding those soil amendments, if you're like bringing compost or something, would be fall, because that gives you time to kind of like till it in or spade it in. And also, if it's something that's like a fresh manure or something like that, that gives it time to compost a little bit before you're actually putting plants in there. So fall is a good time. It helps the organic matter to break down over the winter and become part of the soil. The cost for organic matter can be variable. So some things are expensive, some things are free. Think of things like leaves, grass clippings, compost that you make yourself, or even compost that you buy. It's much cheaper than buying materials in bags. You can also do cover crops. Cover crop is where you plant what they sometimes call a green manure crop, something like a clover or a vetch or ryegrass, or could even be wheat or something like that. There's also some things like turnips and things like that that are sometimes used as a cover crop, and that creates lots of organic matter that then you would till back into your soil, and that would increase your organic matter. That doesn't always work as well in smaller gardens, just because it's hard to chop up all the, cut it down and then chop it up and mix it into the soil. A farmer will have like a big mower that he does that with. He has like a big tall crop of clover or vetch. And then he'll have like a plow, and so he'll turn it over with the plow and bury it in the soil so that the organic matter can break down. For you, you'll probably have to either use a spade or a tiller in order to till that. So sometimes it's easier to get the organic matter that's already broken down, like compost, and add that, or manure. And again, you want to avoid putting down anything like manure or sawdust in the spring, just because it's going to affect your soil growth right away, your plant growth right away, and in a bad way. And as far as your homemade compost, it's hard to generate enough homemade compost to make a big difference, because you need to add lots of organic matter. So lots of times the best way to do that is to collect a bunch of leaves, till them in, maybe go to a farmer and get wheelbarrows full of manure, or a truckload, pickup load of manure, or buy some compost from a compost company. There's numerous compost companies. We've had really good luck from a company called KC Compost. They're out in Belton. You can just drive a pickup truck out there and they'll fill it up for you. It's probably about $40, which is a great price for that much organic matter. If you want to get more than that, you can get it delivered. They charge by the cubic yard and there's a delivery fee, but it's still the cheapest, easiest way to get organic matter, other than perhaps leaves. So it's really good compost. And then, getting ready, getting your soil ready. If it's never been a garden before, you might have to think about tilling it or spading it. And you might have heard some talk about a method of gardening called no-till gardening. And the alternative would be till, where you till your garden. So no-till gardening can work, but you definitely need to do your homework, do your research, and figure out how you're going to do it. One of the best ways would be to, smother out all the grass and then add organic matter. And probably even if you are going to do no-till gardening, I would probably till once, just to break up the ground and add a lot of organic matter. And then after that, if you want to not do tilling, you can do that, but you want to make raised beds and then don't walk on them so you're not compacting the ground. And I will tell you that you can have a really good garden using no-till. You can also have really good gardens if you till your garden. So a lot of it is just about all the other things that you do. If you are going to till your garden, I tell people do it when the soil is at the right moisture level. You don't want to do it when it's muddy. If you till wet soil, it will ruin the soil texture. It will turn all the soil particles into mud balls. And if there's any little bit of clay in there, it will make it very hard mud balls, which will bake hard when the sun comes out. And you'll just be dealing with these large, difficult clods for a long time. So if it doesn't crumble when you till, you should stop tilling and wait for the soil to dry out. If you had mulch on your garden from last fall, like straw or grass clippings, in the springtime, you want to pull all that back and rake it off so that the sun can shine and dry out the soil. Otherwise, the soil will not dry out and you might not be able to till for a long time. If you're tilling in late summer, like you're going to plant for a fall garden, lots of times the soil is too dry, so you might actually have to water it a little bit in order to make some moisture, and then wait a day or two for it to dry out to the perfect level. Because hot, dry summer, you end up with dry soil. Usually when you're tilling, you're trying to till about 6 to 8 inches deep. And I also tell people not to over-till, which means once you've broken it up and it seems like it's broken up pretty good, don't go over it again the second time, a third time, a fourth time. I've seen people do that sometimes just because they're having such a great time and it looks so neat to be tilling up the ground. You can actually ruin the soil structure by tilling it too much. So soil preparation, the tilling, again, the first year is the hardest because you have to break up that sod. So if you are going to get, your yard tilled up and you've got sod, I would actually recommend hiring it out maybe the first year, unless you're pretty experienced using a tiller. You can see in this picture here, this gentleman is using a tractor that has a tiller on the back of it, and he's able to plow up that, or till up that grass with that powerful tiller on the back. Even tilling it by, going and renting a tiller is pretty hard. We saw it in the first year. So that's another reason for starting small. Lots of times it's better to take a shovel, a spade, and turn the ground over by hand, and then come back and till it. It just loosens up the ground and makes that sod easier to deal with. And then once you do till it, have nice soft soil. I do recommend not walking on it, or avoiding walking on it as much as possible, because you don't want to compact it. All right. Did I miss a slide there? Nope, we already did that. Okay, great. All right, so now we're talking about the actual planting, which is one of the most exciting things. And I know if you're a gardener from previous years, you're really, really anxious to get out and start planting, and I am too. I'm really looking forward to that. So you want to plant at the proper times. So you need a good planting calendar. We have one available on our website that you can look for. We also have copies of it here at the office. And this is actually based on one that the University of Missouri Extension Service developed. And so there's some vegetables that like to be planted in cool weather, and some that really need to be planted in warm weather. And that's really important to figure that out. And so we actually have another guide sheet that will tell you about warm season plants and cool season plants. I'll show you a picture of that here in a minute. A lot of people have it in their minds that the best way to figure out when to plant would be to look at a planting calendar or a planting guide from the Farmer's Almanac. Talks about planting by the moon, different phases of the moon. And I do not believe in that at all. I don't think it's a valid way for knowing when to plant. They'll tell you at a certain time of the month you plant crops that are growing above the ground. A certain time of the month you plant crops that grow below the ground. And they're not really talking too much about cool season versus warm season, which is much more important. The other thing is, if you go to like a big box store and get a seed packet that's distributed all over the country, it really won't have good planting dates for you for where you live. It'll just tell you like plant 10 days after the first frost or before the first frost or whatever like that. And sometimes the frost dates change around a lot, so that's not a good guide either. This planting calendar is really, really helpful. And here's a close-up of it. So for instance, if you look at carrots, it tells you here that March 15th to about April 5th is the ideal planting time for carrots. It doesn't mean you can't plant later. You can plant a little bit later, but it may get hot quick, and so these are the ideal planting times for ideal harvest. Or like cabbage plants. You'll look up here and it's under cabbage, and here it mentions plants, because you're not planting a cabbage seed. If you see the word plants there, it means you should plant a plant rather than a seed, because it'll work better for you. If you just go out and plant cabbage seeds, they won't have time to mature before it gets too hot. Same thing with broccoli. You'll also see like under cabbage plants a second date. Let's see if I can make this work better. Yeah, so July 20th to August 5th would be the time for planting for fall garden. So when you see two dates, the first one is for spring, the second one is for fall. If you only see one planting date or one range, that means that it may not be good for fall. So there's really one main time for planting it, like for tomatoes. And again, these are the ideal planting times. But I do recommend them because I think you'll have the best success if you kind of try to plant in that window. Here's the cool season versus warm season. So cool season runs from about March 15th to about April 15th. And those are crops that like cooler weather. The warm season starts about May 1st to June 10th. So those crops that like the warm weather, like tomatoes and cucumbers and squash and melons and peppers and eggplant, those kinds of things like that warm weather. So we have this other handout here And so like on this side are all the cool season vegetables. And on this side are all the warm season vegetables. So like in a couple of weeks, when it's time to start planting, you know, for cool season vegetables, you can just look at all the ones on the left side and pick them out and know that these will all be good for planting at that time, and then go back and look at the planting calendar for some more specific information. And the same thing with the warm season. Once you get to the warm season, you can see which ones are part of that, you know, group for planting in warm weather, and just it's real easy to sort them out. And also you'll just become more familiar with the different vegetables and what their planting seasons are. And then we also have a second cool season, which I've mentioned a couple times, for fall gardens. And what's tricky about that is you don't plant them in the fall because that would be too late. You plant them in late summer. So kind of between July 20th and August 10th, you're planting things like cabbage plants, broccoli plants, but also things like lettuce and spinach, different things like that, arugula, things, beets, carrots that like cool weather, turnips, etc., all those cool season crops. And so we're fortunate if you don't get everything planted for the cool season in the spring, you can plant them again in late summer for fall. The other thing, consideration for planting is weather. You know, most gardeners I know become serious weather watcher. I look at the weather report probably 3 or 4 times a day because I want to see if it's changing, what's happening, what's coming up. So it's a good habit to have. And having smartphones and the internet makes it a lot easier these days. Used to be you had to wait till the 10 o'clock news and watch the weather there. Now you can look it up on your phone. There's different websites, weather.com. There's one called Weather Underground, or now it's called Wonderground. I like that one a lot because it shows you hour by hour what's supposed to happen. Like it'll tell you like this week we're supposed to get snow on Thursday, and they'll tell you what time the snow is supposed to start and you know how much snow you're going to get, you know, hour by hour. Or same thing with rain and what the temperature is going to be. Is it going to be getting above freezing? Is it going to be down to freezing? All those things are so helpful. And you know, there's short range forecasts, you know, just for today, and then there's long range forecasts that try to tell you what's going to happen over the next 10 days. And that is really useful. Now, as you might guess, they're not always right, and sometimes the weather changes, so it's good to continually look at it. But that long range forecast is really helpful if you're trying to plan, like, you know, when you're going to plant your garden. So you're looking at it and it tells you that the weather is going to be great, you know, on Saturday when you're off work and you can plant your garden. Or maybe it tells you that it's going to rain on Sunday, so you make sure you want to do it on Saturday. Don't wait till Sunday, because if you wait till Sunday, it'll be all wet and too wet to plant. So it's really helpful to watch that long day forecast. It'll give you a general sense of what direction the weather is heading. Also will tell you like how much precipitation is expected, what's going to be the high, what's going to be the low. This is going to be too cold. Well, I need to cover up my plants tonight. Those are all valuable things you can learn from watching the weather. And sometimes you might be at a particular site. That's what's good about some of those weather apps, is they're very specific for like your location. Like I live out towards Grandview, and I am looking at the weather that's more in Grandview more than up north of the river or something like that. The other thing is that, you know, when you're planting your garden, there's weather implications. So precipitation is the big one. If it's going to rain, it might affect whether you can plant your garden. You might have to, you know, time it around that. As far as tilling your garden, you don't want to till after the rain. If you're going to weed your garden, you want to weed after the rain because the weeds are easy to pull. So there's lots of things to be watching that weather and the implications of precipitation. Temperature effects also. You don't want to set out tomatoes if it's going to be freezing cold tonight. You might want to wait a few days. If you're going to plant some plants for a fall garden, but the temperatures are up in the 100-degree ranges, you might wait a week until they come down a little bit to the 80s. So all these things, temperature, precipitation, but also even wind and sun. It's going to be super windy and you're putting out little seedlings. Sometimes that can be really hard on them also. All right, as far as actual planting technique, you know, there are lots of videos you can look at if you want to see some planting techniques. We have a really great selection of videos on our website. It will direct you to our YouTube channel if you want to see about planting certain things like how to plant seeds, how to plant plants, some useful videos there that aren't too long. But with seeds, it's important to plant at the proper depth. If you plant your seeds too deep, the seeds will not be able to come up through that deep soil. And so basically, the smaller the seed, the more shallow you want to plant the seed. If it's a bigger seed, like a corn kernel or a pea or a bean, you can plant them deeper, like an inch. If it's tiny little seeds like carrots or lettuce, you're going to be planting more like an eighth of an inch and covering them up very gently with some soil. And then once you plant your seeds, you want to keep them moist. Hopefully it'll rain, but you can't count on rain. So you're going to have to maybe sprinkle your ground. And if you've got little seeds, you want to sprinkle that very gently. You don't want to sprinkle hard with something that's going to wash away the seeds. You can get special nozzle for that. But it's very important to water your seeds after you plant them so they'll start sprouting right away. Then there's different techniques, like sometimes people like to plant squash and cucumber and melons in what they call a hill, which is like a little grouping of 5 or 6 seeds all together in a little raised mountain or mound. And then sometimes you're planting in rows. Sometimes you're broadcasting, like if you're planting maybe turnip greens, broadcasting refers to where you kind of just throw the seeds out and to where they spread out evenly over the ground and cover a bigger area. But generally, you'd be planting seeds in rows until you get used to maybe some other types of planting. And plants, it's important to remember to plant at the proper depth. You don't want to bury the roots way too deep. So you're going to look at that soil level of the plant when it comes out of its little pot, and that's going to be the soil level that you want to plant at. You don't want to bury it too deep. You don't want to have it sticking up out of the air and being with the roots exposed. The other thing that's super important, and we probably need to do a video on this, would be to prepare the root ball. When you take the little plant out of the little container, little pot, or the little 3-pack or 4-pack or the 6-pack, whatever it comes in, the roots typically in a tomato plant will be all bound up. And the same would be true for peppers, eggplant, cabbage, broccoli, any kind of vegetable that grows in a pot. The roots will tend to twine around in a circle and get very bound up and tied up kind of in knots. And that's what's referred to as a root bound. And the problem with that is that then the roots have a hard time untangling themselves and growing out into the surrounding ground for the plant to take off and become healthy and grow well. So what you need to do is loosen those roots. And typically when I remove a plant from a pot, I'm going to rough up that root ball, which means I'm going to take some scissors and cut up the sides and kind of loosen the roots with the scissors and pull them apart. Sometimes you're actually breaking them as you do that, breaking them and cutting them. And it seems really, really like they're going to be hurting that plant, but that is probably the best thing you can do for that plant, because every place where you cut a root or break a root, new roots will grow out, and then they will be able to grow out into the soil rather than just staying twisted up in knots. So we will be doing a video on this soon, so watch for our website on that. We just need to have people be able to see what that looks like. And then after you plant the plant, I like to put a little circle of mulch, at least 6 inches or so in diameter around that plant, and then water it. Even if it's supposed to rain that night, put some water on it, and that will help settle the plant and help the roots to start getting established. The spacing on planting is very important too. You don't want to put your seeds and your plants too close together. I see people doing that all the time, especially like with tomato plants. They'll put them like a foot apart. But tomato plants get pretty large, so a foot is not enough space. Or they might put their squash seeds way too close together, because squash or pumpkins get really large. Same thing with melons. They need a lot of space. Or if people are sprinkling out little lettuce seeds, they put them way too close together and then they don't thin them. So look on the back of your packet of seeds that you're getting, or on your plant. There's a planting guide for how far apart to put things. That garden design tool, garden planning tool that I mentioned that's available on our website will also tell you how far apart the rows are and things like that. So that's very useful. So, plants, the spacing will be different, obviously, than seeds. Seeds, you're planting more than what you think you're going to need, with the idea that if they all come up, you're going to thin out the ones that you don't want. So you will have them at the ideal spacing. And then in raised beds, remember, since we're not having paths in between, you can put the plants a little bit closer, so the spacing will be different for that than for a ground plot. And we actually have a special guide for planting in raised beds that will tell you how far apart to plant your plants or seeds in raised bed. And then sometimes I do what I call predetermined spacing, like for corn or okra. You really want your plants about a foot apart. So rather than sprinkle them all along the row and pulling out most of them later, every foot I'll put like 2 or 3 seeds, 2 or 3 corn kernels, 2 or 3 okra seeds, and then space out another foot, and then put 2 or 3 more seeds, and then another foot and 2 or 3 more seeds. And that way your plants will all be spaced out a foot apart. And then if all the seeds come up, you thin them out, you'll have at least 1 seedling every foot, which is really good spacing for things like the corn and the okra. And it is important to thin out those unneeded plants later, and not wait too long to do that, so that you can do that without disturbing the roots. Also, when you're planting, you want to be thinking about crop rotation. And this is why it's important to have a diagram from your garden from last year. When you hear about rotating your crops, all that means is you're kind of grouping your plants by the plant families that they're in and moving them around in your garden so they're not being planted in the same space each year. And the reason this is important is because some of the plant families are subject to certain insects, certain diseases. Tomatoes especially are subject to certain diseases, and you don't want to plant them in the same place every year, where those diseases will build up in the soil and your tomatoes will not do as well. So it helps if you know your crop families, like the tomato family, the cabbage family, the legume family, which is beans, the cucurbit family, which is like squash and cucumbers and melons, the root crops, different things like that, the leafy crops, the lettuces, etc. So if you get familiar with those and you know them, you want to group your vegetables by those families and then move them around to a different place. If nothing else, at least make sure that you plant your tomatoes in a different place every year as much as possible. And so that's why it's helpful to keep the records of what you did last year and the year before that and this year, etc. All right, as far as planting, there's different cropping plans. You might have just a single crop if you're going to do a warm season, like tomatoes. It's not like you can necessarily plant 2 or 3 crops of tomatoes. You're going to basically plant some and they'll be there most of the season. Double cropping, that means where you plant 2 different crops in a year. So lots of times that'll be a cool season to cool season. Like in the spring, you might plant broccoli in one location, and then you'll harvest that broccoli in June. And then coming up in late July and early August, you might plant another cool season crop, but it might be something totally different. In fact, it would be better if it was totally different. You might plant carrots, or you might plant lettuce, where you planted your broccoli before. So that would be a double crop, because you planted some in the spring and some in late summer for fall. There's also a way to double crop with warm season crops, and that's where you plant kind of a fast growing cool season crop in a bed, like lettuce or spinach. And then when it's time to plant tomatoes, a lot of the lettuce and spinach is still growing, but what you're going to do is you're going to harvest some right where you want to plant a tomato, and then plant a tomato there. So like if you look at this raised bed here, they've got some lettuce, two different kinds of lettuce on this side, and they've got some spinach on this side. So I could see real easily, this stuff has been growing for a while. It's probably about time to plant tomato plants. You might pull out a head of lettuce here, pull out some spinach over here, and then plant a tomato. And then space out, 2.5 to 3 feet, and pull out a lettuce over here, and then some spinach over here, and then plant a couple more tomatoes. And then do the same thing, every 30 inches, every 36 inches. And then those lettuce plants can still finish, and you can still finish harvesting the lettuce and the spinach, because it'll take a while for the tomatoes to get big. And so that way you've had a cool season crop and a warm season crop from the same space. So that's really helpful when you don't have very much raised bed space. So what I tell people to do is whenever you pull a crop out, because it's done, you've harvested it all, then check that planting calendar document that we looked at and see what can go in next. All right, so now you've planted your garden and now you're wanting to take care of it over the season, and there's going to be different tasks, different garden maintenance. So here's kind of a list of them. Obviously, you're going to be doing some weeding. Ideally, you'd be doing mulching. Of course, you want to do watering, might be doing fertilizing, might be doing thinning. Like I talked about a minute ago, where you thin out extra seedlings. Sometimes you'll be doing training, which would be like using a trellis or a cage, like a cage for tomatoes. And then, of course, controlling insects and diseases. Weeding is probably one of the biggest things for gardens. Yeah, there's two different kinds of weeds, two major categories. One is annual weeds. Those are ones that grow all in one year. They sprout up from seeds and then they die in the same year usually. Think of things like lamb's quarters, pigweed, ragweed. Those are common annual weeds. Perennial weeds are the ones that have root systems that survive over the winter, and the tops might die down, but then they come up again the next year. So think of like dandelions, think of bindweed. There's some very weedy grasses that do that. Anyhow, they will also produce seeds and drop seeds, and those seeds will sprout. So either way, whether it's an annual weed or perennial weed, what you want to do is interrupt the life cycle of that weed and not let it get big. So let's say you planted some vegetable seeds, and then you notice some other plants coming up in between where you planted. And those would be the weeds because you didn't plant them. And so what you want to do is get rid of them when they're small and not let them get big. If they get large, you'll have to pull them out by hand. And really, the whole idea of controlling weeds is probably one of the major factors in being a successful gardener. If you let the weeds get away from you, all of a sudden you'll come back and it looks like too much work. You'll give up. You'll say, oh, this is too much work. I can't pull all these weeds out. I should have done it when they were small. So pulling weeds when they're small is good. Even better is cultivating when they're just sprouting. So like if you look at this bare soil, you could see little tiny weeds sprouting up in between. When they're small like that, you can take a hoe or you can take a rototiller down in between there and till out those weeds. It's really easy to do when they're just sprouting, they're very small. If they get bigger, of course, then you have to pull them out by hand, like what this gentleman's doing here. But even better than cultivating with a hoe or a tiller would be to put mulch down. And if you put a layer of mulch down in between these rows, it's going to smother out the weeds that are going to come up, and it's going to help your garden stay moist. We'll talk about mulch here in a minute. So that's the best way to control weeds. A lot of people want to know what kind of weed killers they can use in their garden to kill weeds. And there are some organic materials, but even still, you have to be careful with them, because basically weed killers kill plants, and they will not discriminate. They will kill your garden plants. If you go to the store and buy some weed killer for use in a lawn and you spray it on your garden, it's going to kill all your tomato plants, all your pepper plants, all your bean plants. So that is not good, obviously. That's why you don't want to do that. There are also pre-emergent herbicides. And what that is, it's like a granule material that you put down that stops weeds from sprouting, seeds so they won't sprout. And that seems like a great idea. And if you're doing something like tomato plants or sweet potato plants, that would work. But the problem can be is sometimes that material, if you put too much down, will carry over to the next year. And next year, when you plant something else there from seeds, they won't sprout. So you don't want to do that. So I do not recommend those either. You can also prevent weeds by putting down landscape fabric, that black, stuff that's kind of like netting. It lets the water through. It's kind of a fabric type material. It's not just black plastic, like plastic sheeting. It's more of a fabric material, landscape fabric. People put it around their shrubs, and it helps keep the weeds down. So you can put that down. But again, the best is mulch. And then we also talked about the cultivation. That's where you use like a hoe or a rototiller to tear out the weeds. So sometimes in the spring, I want to let the soil warm up a little bit before I put mulch down. So at that point, I'm using a hoe or a little hand cultivator to help break up the soil so that it stays loose, and also to kill the weeds that are germinating. If you use a mulch, I recommend using grass clippings or straw. Avoid things that would have weed seeds in them. So lots of times, if you get hay, which is different than straw, hay has more weed seeds in it. So I don't recommend using hay as much as straw or grass clippings. A straw might have seeds in it too, but it would be wheat seeds, not weed seeds, which can be a little bit of a problem, but it's pretty easy to deal with those if they start to sprout. So straw is much better. So put down mulch in between the rows, put down mulch around your plants, and mulch deep enough, usually at least 2 inches to start. And then as plants get bigger, you might add it some more to make it about 3 inches deep. That will smother out the weeds and stop them from growing. And if something does pop through, or if you don't get your garden all mulched, at the very least, you want to get rid of those weeds, cut them down, mow them down, use a weed eater, anything. Don't let them get big and tall and start forming seeds. Because if they do that, if they form seeds, it's going to make lots and lots of seeds that will get dropped when the plants die and make a lot more weeds for next year. So again, that mulching is the best thing you can do for weed control, but also has other benefits. As I mentioned, it will conserve soil moisture. It will cool the soil. In the hot summer, the soil heats up really hot, sometimes higher than 100 degrees, and that's not good temperatures for the plant roots. It's also not good temperatures for all the soil microbes. So the mulch will help with the growth of soil microbes, help suppress the weeds, as we mentioned. It will stop the soil from getting packed down, from getting walked on as much, or from the rain. If you have heavy rains, it will pack down the soil and get crusty. And so having mulch on top will prevent that. And the other thing is, at the end of the season, you can take that mulch and till up the mulch into the soil, and you'll be adding organic matter. So it really is just an all-around wonderful practice. And I totally, heartily, completely recommend that you mulch your garden. And I think you'll be much happier, you'll be more successful, and more productive. As far as what to use, straw, lawn clippings, grass clippings. If you have a lawnmower that will catch the grass clippings, lots of times people don't catch their grass clippings anymore. But I like to do that because I like to have all that grass clippings for mulch. But again, you would not want to be spraying your lawn. Don't have a lawn service come and spray weed killers on it, because then you'd be adding that into your garden. If you're going to buy something from a bag for mulch, I would recommend a product called cotton burr compost. That's what we use in our children's garden. It's kind of like ground up peat moss or something like that. Sometimes it's called cotton boll. That's the little husk outside the cotton ball that grows, and they grind that up and turn that into compost. It's also a really good soil conditioner if you're trying to improve your soil. Again, you could also use the weed fabric. You could use shredded leaves. These are all different ways to mulch the soil. But I do not recommend using wood chips. And a lot of people think it's a great idea. They'll use wood chips or even shredded bark. You can buy that in bags. You can get wood chips for free from lawn companies because they don't know what to do with it. They've got so much wood chips, they're trying to get rid of it. But wood chips, I find that it does not really keep the weeds down. The other thing is, as the wood breaks down and decomposes, there's soil organisms that do that, and they need nitrogen. So they'll take the nitrogen out of the soil, those organisms, and they use that and to help them digest the, break down the wood chips. And so your soil can actually get nitrogen depleted. The other thing is, if you're trying to weed by hand, lots of times you can get splinters from the wood chips. And then finally, if your garden's anywhere near your house or a shed, wood chips are prime for attracting termites and other things. So I just don't recommend them for gardens. You might go on the internet and look up, there's places, there's a guy who recommends, mulching your whole garden really thick with 6 inches of wood chips. And he has really good success. Well, part of it is where he gardens. He gardens in the Pacific Northwest. Weather conditions are a little bit different there. Also, they have different kinds of wood chips. So there's some different things. If you really want to try it on a small space, see if it works for you. But I think you'd be so much happier with straw or with grass clippings. I really like using grass clippings. Put the mulch down after the soil warms up a little bit, but before weeds start to grow. And how thick? Start off with maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches, and then maybe add it some more later because it will sink down a little bit so you get a nice maybe 3-inch layer of mulch. And then at the end of the year, ideally you would till that in and improve your soil by adding that organic matter. We're almost to the end here. Watering, very important. Younger crops need to be watered more often and shallower. You don't need to water deeply. When your crops have been growing for a while, their roots go down farther, they're established. You're going to water less often, but you're going to water more deeply. You want the water to go down deep all the way to the bottom roots. So you're going to need more water, like 1 inch to 1.5 inches per week. Watering also does help cool the soil down on very hot days, so that's good. Lots of times people think you can't water on a sunny day because you're going to somehow, the water will act like a magnifying glass and burn the leaves. And there's absolutely no truth to that internet rumor whatsoever. For seeds and seedlings, I like using a really gentle nozzle called a water breaker, so you won't be damaging those little baby plants, little seedlings. Again, you're going to mulch to reduce evaporation. Sometimes you might be putting out like a sprinkler to water the whole garden, but lots of times you'll just be watering a particular group of plants. That's what I call spot watering, because they might need water sooner than the other plants do. But if you have a good hose with a good water breaker, it's fairly easy to do a small garden. If it gets much larger or very large, you might want a sprinkler system, soaker hoses, and possibly use a drip irrigation system. Fertilizing your garden, there's very many ways to fertilize. You can buy or get access to manures and use that for your fertilizer. You can buy other soil amendments, organic materials. There's even some liquid fertilizers. There's chemical fertilizers, and there's organic fertilizers. I like the organic fertilizers because they are slow release. They don't release too much at once. It's real easy with the chemical fertilizer because they quick release to get too much and actually damage your plants because you put down too much. Again, soil testing will give you an idea of how much fertilizing you might need to do if you need to add phosphorus or potassium or whatever. And liquid, if you just have small amounts of plants to fertilize, liquid is easier. You mix it up in a watering can and water with it. Here at the Community Gardens, with your membership, you get some chicken manure fertilizer that's been pelletized, so it's easy to put that down. So whatever it is, whatever kind of fertilizer you're going to do, follow the instructions and don't think that because it says to do a certain amount, that if you do twice the amount, that will make it better. Because usually that makes it worse because you're putting too much fertilizer down. So Also, I never recommend putting fertilizer right in the bottom of a planting pole. Like if you're going to set out a tomato plant, a pepper plant, don't put fertilizer right in the bottom of the hole because the roots are going to be sitting right on top of that, and it's going to be too much for them, too strong, and it'll be a shock. And literally, sometimes the plants can die overnight. Thinning is what we talked about, where you pull out the extra seeds that you planted. If you're planting a whole row, right here, somebody planted some beets, you know, and they're thinning them out because really you want those beets to be at least 1.5 to 2 inches apart, and it looks like they're like 1/4 inch apart. So you need to pull out the extra ones. It's better to do that while they're small, so you're not ripping out the roots of the plants that you want to leave. And it's also better to do it while the ground is moist. When the ground is moist, they slip right out, and it's easy to do that. And it's okay. People worry about, you know, they think, oh my gosh, I'm killing all these little baby plants. And it's hard for them to throw them away, so they don't even want to thin. And so the plants grow up too crowded. They have small leaves. If it's a fruiting plant, they don't produce fruits. The plants just don't develop like they should. So it's okay to throw them away, but you can also eat certain seedlings that are useful, like your microgreens. Think of things like lettuce and spinach and arugula, beets and onions. You can thin them out and eat them. Put them in a salad. Of course, you want to wash them first, so they're useful. Rarely does it work to try and take a seedling and dig it up and move it to another location and try and replant it. It might work with lettuce, might work with some other things, but typically it doesn't work really well. And if you do that, you want to water it right away so the roots will get settled. The other part of garden maintenance is training. We talked about trellises and cages. You want to use sturdy materials, heavy-duty cages, concrete reinforcing wire, lumber, stakes, etc. You need some good tools if you're going to do something like the tomato cages, concrete reinforcing wire. If you're using cattle panels, you need some bolt cutters and zip ties. The plants that need some training, of course, are tomatoes, like maybe on a cage or on a wall, a trellis. Peas, of course, need a trellis. There's some pole beans, need trellises. Cucumbers like to climb on a trellis. So it's important to put those up before the plants get too big. I cannot tell you how many times I personally have done it where I'll plant the peas and the peas need something to climb on because they're getting bigger, and I haven't put them up, and I go out and the peas are all falling down on the ground. So put them up soon. Same thing with tomato cages. Don't wait too long. Put the tomato cages on when the tomatoes are small, because once the plants start to get big, it's hard to get the cage around them without breaking off branches. So it's real important to do it soon. Here's some different kinds of trellising materials. Up in the upper right-hand corner, you see concrete reinforcing wire tomato cage. We like those a lot because they're big and sturdy. I also like to use cattle panels for trellises. They make really nice trellises for things to climb up. Here's some just tomato stakes. Looks like people are using. These are some cattle panels that we use for growing gourds in our children's garden. So lots of different materials you can use. Insects and diseases. Insects are generally more of a problem than diseases, but that isn't to say there aren't disease problems. Diseases are usually caused by either fungus, bacteria, or virus, or environmental conditions. And again, that's going to be a little more unusual, but again, certain plants more than others are subject to certain diseases. You know, certain crops, you can just count on certain insects happening. Squash bugs. If you're going to plant squash, you're going to get squash bugs. You're going to get squash vine borers. So that will happen. Cucumber beetles. If you're going to plant squash and cucumbers, you're going to see them. If you're going to plant eggplants, you're going to have flea beetles. If you're going to grow corn, you're going to have earworms. If you're going to grow members of the cabbage family, the crucifer family, you're going to get cabbage loopers, things like cabbage broccoli. The little cabbage worms grow and eat up your cabbage, your collards, your broccoli, etc. So some of those, there's some easy things to do. Other ones are kind of difficult, so you just want to be aware of them if you're going to grow those crops specifically. And we talked about different ways to control insects, rotating the crops, insect exclusion using row cover, hand picking, and then of course using organic insect controls. There's BT is the products, spinosad, neem oil, those are all organic insect controls. If you really want to learn more about that, we will have a workshop coming up for insects, controlling insects. And we also even have the last year's one available online if you want to look at that now. So those are all the things for insects and diseases, but general things we talked about: rotating the crops, tilling in the fall, adding organic matter, learning which insects are good, which ones are bad, trying to figure it out and get help, and then spraying rather than just reaching for the spray bottle and spraying before you even know what you're dealing with. And of course, fall garden cleanup will help get rid of some of those insect eggs and overwintering insects. As far as harvesting and storage, that's kind of the last stage of vegetable gardening. Picking things at the proper stage. This is something you will learn as you do it more often, but you can also read about the different crops. When's the ideal stage to pick something? You're trying to pick a crop at the best taste, whatever stage it has the best taste. Obviously, if the tomato's not ripe, it's not going to taste good. If a pepper turns red and it's ripe, that's going to be a better tasting than a green pepper. If you wait too long for your lettuce, it might go to seed and then be bitter tasting. Also, maximum nutrition. You know, if a crop isn't very large, sometimes it hasn't formed its leaves very well, or it's not ripe like a tomato. It's not as nutritious at that stage. A red bell pepper is much more nutritious than a green bell pepper. So you're looking at the ideal stages for eating, and also the ideal stage for storage. If you let your broccoli go too long, it won't keep very long in the refrigerator. Same thing with lettuce. If you let your sweet potatoes go too long, sometimes they'll split open. They won't keep very long. So there's good storage conditions, proper stages for picking and for eating and for storage. And it's going to be different for different crops. Brussels sprouts, collard greens, you actually wait till after you had a light frost. During the cool weather, they reach their maximum flavor, sweetness. And some things will actually ripen a little bit off the plant, notably tomatoes. But if you pick a tomato when it's totally green, it may turn red, but it won't ripen with flavor. If you at least wait till the tomato starts to turn red and then you pick it off so that it doesn't get eaten up by squirrels or whatever. If it started to turn red before you pick it, it will ripen off the vine on your kitchen table and it will still have good flavor. So that's definitely something worth knowing. And storage, again, refrigeration will be important for many crops, usually the leafy crops. The things that you see refrigerated at the grocery store are things that you want to refrigerate in your house. Things like green peas, lettuce, broccoli, arugula, many of the greens, cabbage, they go bad fast at room temperature. They need to be refrigerated. Some things you never want to refrigerate unless certain circumstances. So I think of things like tomatoes. You pick a beautiful red ripe tomato and you put it in the refrigerator, it will lose all of its flavor. It will not taste good. Potatoes don't really store well. Sweet potatoes are tropical vegetables. They do not like cold storage at all. Eggplant really doesn't like to be stored cold. The only time I would store a tomato in the refrigerator, or a potato, or a sweet potato, is after I've already cooked it some. Then I would store it in the refrigerator. Or tomato, you know, if you've already sliced half of it, or already sliced half of an onion, yeah, you definitely want to store it in the refrigerator. But again, it's better to eat the whole tomato while it's really fresh and ripe rather than putting it in the refrigerator. So that's our presentation for today. We'll look at our questions here. We're a little bit over time. I apologize for that. There's our office location. We're in Slope Park, 6917 Kensington. Come visit us sometime. We have a wonderful children's garden that opens in June. You can see all different kinds of plants and varieties, lots of things you may never have seen before. There's our phone number if you want to get information, and I definitely recommend our website. We have a great website that Rob has put together for us with lots of great information, lots of great resources, and calendars, dates on when to um, come and get your tomato plants, things like that. Also, there are also, will tell you resources like garden videos. So lots of great resources there. It will also tell you about the membership, because we are a membership organization. You can join Kansas City Community Gardens and become a member. It's based on your income level. With your membership, you get 10 packages of seed. You get 10 pounds of fertilizer. You can buy vegetable plants at a discount. We also have organic insect controls and cotton burr compost and mulch. We sell extra organic fertilizer, extra seeds, all those things. We're really trying to make gardening affordable for families so they can grow their own food. We also work with schools to do school gardens. We work with community organizations to do community gardens. And we also do community orchards, our Give and Grow program. We're establishing community orchards all around the city. So you'll find lots of information on our website about those different programs. Right now, I'm going to look and see if we have questions. And I'm going to see if Rob.
Yeah, I sent you, we had about, I think about 5 questions there, Ben. So check your email and they should be.
Okay, yep, I'm bringing it up right now. All right, yes. So first question is, how do you amend clay soil? So that is difficult, but the answer is organic matter. Really, if you look at clay soil, the main thing that's absent is there's no organic matter. It's all mineral matter. So it's hard. And if you have really bad clay soil, it's going to take a lot of organic matter. So in that case, it's really worth buying compost by the truckload and getting several cubic yards, having it dumped on your garden, and then trying to mix that in with your soil. And the way to do that would be to till it in to the clay soil. And again, you're going to want the soil to be moderately dry when you do that. If it's wet, the clay soil will just form little balls of mud and it won't till in at all. So the organic matter will help do that and help mix it up and make it better. And it really is, again, that's what I would tell you for a regular soil, but especially with clay soil, you need to add organic matter. Okay, next question would be, what would crop rotation look like for a raised bed? Person has just a 5 by 8 foot bed and had tomato plants in it last year. Can you do tomato plants again this year in the same bed, just in a different location? Yes, I would say if you have a raised bed, and let's say you're only using half of the raised bed for tomatoes and maybe using other crops in the other half, from year to year, switch them back and forth, and that will help. The other thing that will help with that would be to make sure that you use tomatoes that are disease resistant, like the Celebrity is a good one, especially that new one I mentioned called Iron Lady, because they'll be disease resistant. Because the main problem with not rotating your crops with the tomatoes is the diseases that build up in the soil. So make sure you pick a disease resistant variety. The heirlooms would not work well because they are super prone, susceptible to diseases, so they don't do as well. But the ones that are disease resistant, like Celebrity, that Iron Lady, would do much better. So you can do that and plant them in the same place if you have to. The other alternative would be just to skip planting tomatoes for a year, but that's hard to do. So I would probably not do that. I would still plant in the same place. Or if you have a container and you only got one container, you might have to plant in the same place. But again, plant a disease-resistant tomato. Make sure you have some organic matter because that will help fight off the diseases as well. And use mulch because that will stop the soil from splashing up onto the leaves of the tomato. The next question is, will seeds germinate and plants grow in toxic soil? Well, by toxic, you could be meaning something like too much of one nutrient. So if you had, for instance, too much potassium, you see that sometimes in the soil, comes back with the soil test that it's way too high, and the plants don't do well, they don't thrive. So that would be a toxicity thing. You could also have toxic soil that might have lead in it. So it's toxic for you, but it doesn't really seem to hurt the plants. The plants seem to be doing fine, but you don't want to be eating plants that have lead in them. So that's why if you, for some reason, suspect lead, like you had a building torn down, or it's right next to a roadway where there used to be close enough to the where the fumes from gasoline engines, which used to have lead in the gasoline, that could be an issue, or industrial site of some kind, that could be an issue too. So, but if it's just backyard, you're probably not likely to have toxic soil. Fine. The other way that you can get toxic soil would be like if someone dumped too much weed killer in a location because they were trying to kill out all the weeds and they didn't follow directions. So if you notice a spot in your backyard where nothing grows, not even weeds, that could be a sign that somebody dumped something there that was not good. But usually if you see weed growth or lawn growth and it looks healthy, that means that probably there wasn't any kind of toxic weed killers there, so you're probably safe. All right. When you say don't use manure in the spring, does this mean chicken poop too? Okay, so that's a very good question, because the fertilizer that we offer is a chicken manure fertilizer. The difference being that that is not fresh, it has been composted. So it is already composted. If you buy cattle manure in a bag that's already been composted, you could add that in the spring. So my instruction about not putting manure down in the spring was primarily referring to fresh manure that you might get like from a farm, or if you have chickens that you raise, or horse nearby or whatever, that would be fresh manure. And even if they tell you it's aged, it needs to be thoroughly composted. So I would collect the manure over the summer, compost it, put it on in the fall, and then till it in the fall, and then it would be safe for using next spring. So, but even still, with our chicken manure fertilizer, you don't want to overdo it and put too much down. And the last question was, does it matter which direction you place your beds in, north, south versus east and west? And this is a good question, because the traditional wisdom has been for row gardens to plant north-south, because that way as the sun comes over, it's going to be hitting it evenly, coming up in the east and setting in the west. In the raised bed, it doesn't make as much difference because you're going to be planting things equidistantly. So I typically don't worry about north, south, east, west when I'm putting my raised beds in. What I worry more about is there any slope? I have a little bit of slope in my garden, so I put them to run parallel to the slope, so that it's like they're making little terraces as they go down the slope. That's more important when placing your raised beds rather than the north, south, east, west location. You still have to be careful if you're planting something tall in your raised beds, like if you're planting corn in one raised bed, you wouldn't want to plant it on the south side of some lower growing crop because it might actually shade it out. So just need to be careful of things like that. And I think that's all the questions that I see. If you do have questions, sometimes you can, of course, ask questions when you come into our office. You can also send email questions to our contact email, which is just contact@kccg.org. I think that's it for now. Thank you, everybody. I do recommend, if you haven't been out to visit us, come visit the community gardens and just check us out, find out more about us, and get copies of our Seeders Digest, list of seeds and plants that we'll have available, and check out all the gardening resources on our website. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah, no more further questions, Ben. So everybody have a good night.